I'm just going to say a few words about the NJA and ask Steve Winston to show a short video, and then we will proceed with the meeting. Those of you who don't know, the National Jewish Assembly was formed a year ago. We have three main objectives, which is promoting Jewish life, supporting Israel, fighting anti-Semitism. We operate a little bit like a political party in the sense that members, of which we now have about 350 paid up members, they pay a subscription, which is now £10 a year. And for your money, what you get invited to about 20 meetings a year like this, with other speakers, also social events, also debates on political subjects relevant to the Jewish community, and also you can join committees. And then over the year, there'll be loads of events like that, and then a year later, you're asked to pay another £10. The objective of the NGA eventually is to start gaining political influence with government, and in essence to further the three main principles that I've just mentioned. So let me get on with the main business of the meeting, which is to introduce our guest speaker and his interviewer. It's my great pleasure to welcome our guest speaker this evening, the new editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post, Avi Mayer. Avi, who was born in New York and lives in Jerusalem, comes to the role with a background in communications and online activism rather than journalism. He most recently served as the managing director of global communications and public affairs for the AJC, that's the American Jewish Committee, and previously served as the spokesperson for the Jewish Agency for Israel. He's also served in the spokesperson unit of the IDF, and before enlisting, Avi briefly worked for Eretz Acheret, an Israeli magazine. Avi is probably best known for his presence on Twitter, where, the last time I noticed, he had over 140,000 followers. He posts a mix of news updates, advocacy for Israel, and pictures of freshly baked challah. And he's clashed frequently with anti-Israel activists, not surprisingly. Now, Avi's going to be interviewed tonight by Jonny Gould, who's a British media presenter, a sports journalist, and above all, a political commentator. Jonny has formerly broadcast on Sky News, Smooth Radio, and TalkSport, among others. He's commented on anti-Semitism, conservative politics, and the state of Israel across a number of outlets, including his own Jonny Gould Jewish State podcast. This podcast began in 2018 and featured issues related to Israel and anti-Semitism in the United Kingdom, as well as a focus on conservative politics. Guests that he's interviewed have included prominent politicians and diplomats. So without further ado, can I hand over to Jonny to interview Avi? Jonny.
Gary, thank you very much indeed, and a warm welcome to everyone here on the National Jewish Assembly meeting, a special interview session on Yom Yerushalayim with the National Jewish Assembly and our special guest, editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post. A warm welcome to Avi Mayer. Hello, Avi.
Hello, good evening.
What a lovely site you have, and that's not one of those Zoom sites, that is a real backdrop.
It is indeed. I'm here in the center of Jerusalem, monitoring the situation on the ground.
It's always darker at night in Jerusalem than it is here in London. It's like a sort of light afternoon in comparison. Now, you are now editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post, as we've said. You served as international spokesman for the Jewish Agency before, as Gary intimated, before being managing director of the American Jewish Committee, Public Affairs, and senior spokesman. Now, given this route into the role as Jerusalem Post editor-in-chief, you're editor of one of the grandest of international titles with a great history, a history even longer than the State of Israel. It was, of course, called the Palestine Post before the 14th of May, 1948. But your role must be more than journalistic. It has a feel of diplomacy about it, your role. Is that a fair assessment?
I think it certainly is. First of all, let me express my appreciation to the National Jewish Assembly for having us on this evening. It is, of course, a special evening, Yom Yerushalayim, Jerusalem Day. It's a celebratory occasion, and I'm delighted to be celebrating it with you. The Palestine Post, as it was once known, and Jerusalem Post today, really was created.
Did you put Zoom on your phone, on your computer?
I'm sorry?
I think we've got some talking from in the gang, don't worry.
Yes, it would be wise if everyone muted themselves. The Palestine Post was created to serve as a voice for the Jewish community in Palestine back in 1932. It was the feeling of Gershon Agronsky, who was a longtime journalist and an American immigrant to this country, that the voice of the Jewish community was not being well conveyed and was not being heard, particularly by the British Mandate authorities at the time. And since that day until today, 91 years almost, that is the role that we have played, serving as a voice for this part of the world, telling the story of this remarkable place and of its people, the good, the bad, and sometimes the ugly. And it's my contention that that is actually the greatest service that we can offer the people of Israel, telling the authentic story of the situation on the ground in all of its gritty reality. We have opinions that run the entire spectrum of opinion, from right to left, religious, secular, Arab, Jewish, in Israel and around the world. We're extremely proud of that. We're proud of our centrism. We're proud that our news reporting is viewed as reputable and unbiased. And that is the role that we feel we have to play. I think that that is certainly diplomatic in some respect, because at the end of the day, diplomacy is all about conveying the sense of a country around the world. And that is exactly what we do every single day.
Very interesting, Avi. I've got to ask, how rooted in its foundations as a company, an organization that actually existed before the State of Israel, is the Jerusalem Post today? The thing about my podcast, Jonny Gould's Jewish State, the dynamics of it is that I know for a fact that most of my audience is not Jewish. So are you a medium that also looks outward from Jerusalem rather than inward?
Certainly. So we do have a daily print publication. We are a very robust print newspaper. We remain so. We will continue to be so. But that audience, of course, is within Israel. It's a mix of English-speaking immigrants to Israel, many of them from the UK, tourists, diplomats, members of the government community. But it's a relatively small audience, certainly when compared to our online audience, which is about 12 million people per month, making us by far the most read English language news outlet in Israel and the Jewish world. And we are extremely cognizant of the fact that our content is being read by people who may not be inclined to support Israel, who may not understand the complexity or the nuance of what happens on the ground. And so we calibrate our content accordingly, making sure that we are conveying the authentic reality on the ground. And we feel that that really is a role that we are well positioned to play as really the largest player in this space.
Avi, there's a lot of importance of the Jerusalem Post as the newspaper of record for the region, the reputation of the newspaper to uphold its values. So what can we expect from your editorship, taking the reins as you have from Yaakov Katz, who led for 7 years? You've committed just now to a future in paper, which is good news. Happy about that, to hear that a newspaper remains a paper product. But obviously Yaakov's time in the paper went through some seismic changes, and here you are in a 12 million strong a month digital entity as well. What can we expect from your editorship?
Look, I view it as a tremendous honor that Yaakov bequeathed to me this remarkable institution that he did cultivate for 7 years and that he grew to its present state. I can only hope to build on his successes and stand on the shoulders of that giant, Yaakov, and his predecessors as well. But I have several priorities. I would say, first of all, I view it as a high priority to totally revamp our online presence. I think that it could use some work. I think it needs to be brought up to date and a reflection of where the digital world is at. I'm not sure that it's there quite yet. I certainly want to further establish our stature as the platform for the Jewish conversation. I think that to some extent, and to a significant extent, we're already that, but I want it to be even more so. I want us to be viewed as a fair platform for all players, for all voices within the Jewish world and within Israeli society, Jewish and non-Jewish. Again, I think that we are largely that, but I want to make sure that we are cementing that even further. And underpinning all of this are a series of values that I actually articulated in my first column as editor-in-chief. And the first value that I expressed in that piece was that we are a Zionist paper. I think that was the first time that those words had actually been uttered. But it was important for me to make that statement, to say that we're going to stand against all forms of anti-Zionism. We believe the Jews have an inherent right to self-determination, and that right is realized in the modern state of Israel, which of course we celebrate. I then noted that we are a pro-democracy paper, that we are an anti-racist paper, that we will stand against all forms of hate and bigotry, of course, including anti-Semitism, which of course includes anti-Zionism. And those are going to be the values that continue to drive our work day in and day out. They already have, they already do. But it was important for me to actually say that explicitly, so that not only are we holding ourselves to account, but we're being held to account by our readership as well. And I think that that's tremendously important for any journalistic endeavor.
In your determination to keep it centrist, but have all opinions conveyed, where'd you draw the line when you see a bit of copy from someone, but you believe in free speech? Avi, as an editor, where'd you draw the line?
Look, we will not publish hate or bigotry targeting anyone, including, of course, Jews. We will not publish anti-Zionism. This won't appear on our paper. We think that those are pretty broad lines. And we think that within that space, there is a huge amount of debate, a huge amount of space for debate. A publication that can, on a Wednesday, publish a piece by one columnist arguing that the continued Israeli presence in the West Bank is a stain on Israel and on the Jewish conscience, and then 2 days later publish another columnist who says that the Israeli left is in cahoots with Hamas, and that they are taking cues from one another in their recent activities. That's the kind of place I want to be, because it shows the breadth of opinion that we can represent on our pages, and the fact that we really are a free and open space for many different kinds of opinions, again, within certain, I think, reasonable boundaries.
So, Avi, when it comes to the world of digital, this certainly drives awareness of individuals and organizations. And when it comes to Twitter, you came to prominence in 2017 when the Jewish Telegraphic Agency named you the third most influential Jewish tweeter, just behind Benjamin Netanyahu. Which begs the question: number one, who was the most influential Jewish tweeter, and what on earth were you tweeting?
Well, the number one Jewish tweeter at the time was William Daroff, who's now the president of the Conference of Presidents in the United States, who's of course a very prominent Jewish figure and a very active member of the Jewish Twitter community. I think, as was mentioned earlier, I have used that platform in a variety of ways, most prominently to advocate for Israel and tell Israel's story. Again, the good, the bad, and the ugly, but a lot of good, because I think there is a great deal of good that comes to this part of the world. But also sort of sharing more personal reflections and putting a more human face on what happens on the ground. I feel that a lot of what happens here is portrayed in dry statistical terms that may not be particularly well received by audiences around the world. And it's important for me to put that more personal spin on it, amongst other things by means of my weekly challah posts, which are quite popular. But that's mostly what I've been using it for. I will say that I've taken a bit of a step back from Twitter since taking on this role. And I, it's interesting because I've had quite a few people come over to me and say, doesn't it seem like a step backwards? Because isn't Twitter and isn't social media the wave of the future? And I've always believed, and I continue to believe, that traditional media has a certain added value that social media simply will never have. There's a degree of credibility, there's a degree of gravitas that the traditional media has, and again, I think will always have, that cannot be matched by social media in any way. And it's a tremendous privilege to be able to take on that mantle.
I think that's the key, isn't it? That is the debate that's going on between us who have a foot in both camps, the traditional media chaps and chapesses, and those of us who have a prolific following on Twitter. And you only have to scroll through your timeline to see that a curated media still has more than that, has a vital role to play in delivering some sort of consensus to the world.
I think that's exactly true. And at the end of the day, if you're scrolling through your social media feed and you see a series of people whose names you may or may not recognize But then that's punctuated by the name of a reputable news source that will automatically carry more weight. And I think that that is unavoidable. And I think that, for all of the remarkable achievements that the social media revolution has brought, that is one that it has not managed to kill off, and I don't think it ever will. And so I think that having a news organization behind you, one that cares about credibility, one that cares about fact checking, one that carries its reputation as a mark of honor, is really something that cannot be replaced in any way. And that is certainly something that I've seen during my brief period in this position so far.
Avi, let's have a little bit of background on you. A couple of years ago, before the pandemic, 3 years ago, I had the privilege of working in the Shalom Tower with a startup called Cytoreason, which was developing artificial intelligence attempts to cure the world of its diseases by creating huge sort of physical disease models and then trying to compare the diseases with each other to create bespoke medication, a really typical, beautiful Israeli kind of idea of healing the world. And everyone who worked there was in their early to late 30s. They were all PhDs, and they were part of the first generation of Israelis who could be high income earning people without having to, leave for Silicon Valley or, go to New York, come to London, go to Geneva or whatever. This is a group of Israeli people whose parents were Israeli, in many, many cases, even grandparents as well, but who could lead a life of first world industry within Israel. And I think that's your story as well, isn't it? I mean, you were the first Israeli member of the AJC's management team, and I think that's really quite significant, I feel.
Yeah, look, it was a tremendous leap of faith that AJC took on me when I was brought into that role back in 2018, in bringing on someone who was not based in New York, like every other member of the senior management team at the time. But I think it was important for them to have that Israeli voice at the table. I oversaw global communications and public affairs. It was very much an outward-facing role, and it's one that I very much enjoyed. I also enjoyed being able to sort of tell the story of Israel in our weekly senior staff meetings, to serve as a resource, to serve as a sounding board for various advocacy initiatives that we were considering about support for Israel, which I know is very important to NJA as well. And that was a role that I was very honored to play, and that I felt I would say, well positioned to play. Because of my dual identity as an American Israeli, an American immigrant to Israel, someone who has one foot on either side of the Atlantic at any given time, I think that's the role that I was meant to play in that particular capacity. And it's also one that I think I play in my current role, meaning the fact that I am attuned to how Americans, English speakers around the world are perceiving Israel. The sort of media that they consume is the media that I consume. And so adapting our voice to ensure that we are filling those gaps that exist, that we are portraying a voice that is unique to this region, that is unique to the people who actually live here, that's something that I very much enjoy and something that I will relish in this role.
Indeed, a graduate of the University of Maryland, as you say, you live in Jerusalem now, and there definitely has been a professionalization of the English-speaking narrative for the State of Israel. When I was growing up, I used to, and I was quite young at doing this, but I was watching Israeli politicians of the 70s through my eyes because of the very sharp Yiddish-style Ivrit that was being spoken in a very sort of frank way. It wasn't helping in English in telling Israel's story. The sort of generation that formed the State of Israel and that were governors and prime ministers and opposition leaders in the 1970s. But Israel has got extremely good at being able to tell its story. However, because of the growth of anti-Zionism as the expression of 21st century anti-Semitism, how much have we pushed the needle as Israel supporters in the Anglosphere? How are we doing speaking in English to the world?
I think we're doing okay. I think, as you say, we are doing better than perhaps we did in the past, but I also think that the challenges are greater than they have been. Just numerically, Jews are vastly outnumbered by their detractors, including those who are not particularly inclined to support Israel, or in fact quite disinclined to support Israel. And that poses a tremendous challenge, particularly in the social media era, where everyone has a voice. And in many respects, those voices are quite flat, with the exception, again, of media organizations and other more reputable voices. Everyone else has a pretty equal share and a pretty equal voice to portray in the conversation. And so that does pose a challenge, and also requires that, or it calls upon us to be more sophisticated in our approach. And I will say that Israeli government entities and also nonprofit organizations and charities and advocacy groups around the world that do support Israel have gotten way smarter about how to target the right audiences, how to utilize influencers, that is, people who have very large social media followings, bringing them to Israel, showing them the reality on the ground, and then utilizing them to amplify Israel's story. I think is something that has been done with significant success. And as you say, just utilizing individuals as spokespeople whose first language is English, who are able to speak to audiences in not only the language they understand, but with the nuances that make sense to them, using cultural references that are familiar. I think that in itself is tremendously significant, and that is something that I have seen much more in recent years than I think I ever had before.
Which is great. One of my early learnings was as a 23-year-old working at the BBC World Service, the unbelievable power of English to cross boundaries. Mm-hmm. And when I talk about English, I mean English. Talking like you're from this part of the world had an amazing power, and it inspired me to set up the podcast, because I thought with my set of skills, my skill set, it was the best way that I could defend diaspora Jewry and defend the state of Israel out there. And certainly your time at the AJC heralded an undercurrent of an anti-Semitism, I think, which shocked a lot of people around the world, sort of the early adopters, should we say, of the worry about American Jewry, like the Chabad crew of the sort of post-war time. They understood that America was perhaps no different from any other country, even though it was the Golden Medina, even though it was a place of great liberation and freedom, that essentially for Jews, it was another foreign country. And you've written extensively on the rise of anti-Semitism in the United States, threats from both the left and the right. So the question I'm going to ask is this golden age, this 100 years of American Jewry now at the end, is the genie out of the bottle? Are we going to see increased aliyah or flight from the United States, or perhaps growing assimilation into American society for those who are not willing to remain as Jews or indeed Zionists?
Look, I don't want to minimize the incredible role that America has played in Jewish life over the past several hundred years. America has been incredibly good to the Jews and remains incredibly good to the Jews to this day. It is, for the most part, a safe place to be Jewish, a safe place to celebrate one's Judaism, a place where Jews feel comfortable identifying as such. And yet, as you say, there have been developments in recent years that have caused some to question their degree of safety and the degree to which they are, in fact, comfortable expressing their Jewishness. The most notable of those, perhaps, was the attack on the synagogue in Pittsburgh in 2018, which really shook not only American Jews, but the world. I think for many, the notion that such a horrific anti-Semitic attack, such a blatantly anti-Semitic attack could take place in America would have been completely unheard of until it happened. Since then, there have been several other violent attacks and others that sort of go under the radar, where Hasidic Jews in Brooklyn are beaten on an almost daily basis, where synagogues, Jewish community centers, Jewish schools across the country are targeted with graffiti, targeting Israel, targeting Jews. where Jews are perhaps not viewed as being in the same category of protected groups as others. And that is causing many to question the degree to which they feel comfortable identifying openly as Jewish. One of the most shocking findings that we had when AJC conducted the first ever survey of American Jews on the subject of anti-Semitism in America was the sheer number of American Jews who said that they don't feel comfortable putting on a kippah, wearing a Jewish star, wearing T-shirts that have Hebrew on them for fear of attack, for fear of their physical safety as Jews. And that is an extremely worrying development, something that we, again, would never have imagined that we would have seen in the United States, something that I think others have certainly encountered elsewhere in the world, and we had been familiar with, and we'd heard about stories like that in places like France and Belgium and elsewhere. But the fact that you could have such a significant number of Jews in America who said that they did not feel comfortable identifying as Jewish really was and remains a troubling development. Now, does that necessarily mean that we're going to start seeing Jews fleeing from America? I don't think we will. Certainly not in significant numbers. There were suggestions that in the aftermath of these attacks, we would start seeing a wave of aliyah, a wave of immigration to Israel. That did not materialize, and I don't expect that it will. But it does require us to be much more assertive in standing up against anti-Semitism. The current White House, the Biden White House, is on the brink of unveiling a national strategy to combat anti-Semitism that, of course, is very welcome and has been celebrated by various Jewish organizations. Just last night, the President of the United States hosted, or 2 nights ago, hosted a Jewish American Heritage Month reception, celebration, which his way and of his White House's way of showing solidarity with the Jewish community and showing respect for the contributions of Jewish Americans to American society. But much more needs to be done. And I think one of the challenges is that anti-Semitism has been tremendously politicized, meaning both sides of the political map in the United States are extremely eager to point fingers across the aisle and say, well, the problem is in their right. The right will say that the problem is in the left. The left will say the problem is on the right. When in fact, the problem exists in both places. It expresses itself perhaps in different ways, but it is much more important that political leaders look inward and rout out anti-Semitism from within before they point fingers and try to accuse others of anti-Semitism. That's something that American Jewish groups, will continue to encourage and call upon their leaders to do.
Avi, if you look at the roll call of the last 3 presidents of the United States, you can see the full-blown culture war. There couldn't be 2 different men, more different men than Barack Obama and Donald Trump, and then Joe Biden restored the culture war back the needle of Obama's way, and Trump appears to be coming back despite all the controversies that face him. And of course, Ron DeSantis in Florida is putting points on the board, as he keeps saying. What do we think? And this is from Sam as well. Sam has beaten me to it. Sam has asked a question to the group. Thank you, Sam. Where is the cause of the dramatic rise in anti-Semitism in the United States? We talk about it being politicized there, as you mentioned before. But as Douglas Murray said online today, and he said it in my podcast last year, it's not a political issue. It's not a left and right thing. But it's become so politicized.
Look, I think anti-Semitism is unique in that it cannot be ascribed to one side of the political map or the other. It comes from the left, the right. It comes from extremist elements in various religious and ethnic groups. And this is something that makes it a multi-headed monster that is extremely difficult to slay. But that doesn't mean that we can't and shouldn't try. We have to try. It is vital for the continued existence and flourishing of the American Jewish community and of Jewish communities around the world that we combat anti-Semitism in all its forms. And those forms do include anti-Zionism. That is, I think, indisputable at this point. One of the questions that we actually asked in our survey of American Jews was whether they regarded anti-Zionism as represented by the phrase, the state of Israel has no right to exist, as a form of anti-Semitism. And overwhelmingly, American Jews said yes, that phrase, which again, we view as an expression of anti-Zionism, is indeed an anti-Semitic statement. And by the way, when we ran a parallel survey of the American Jewish, the American community, the American society writ large, the majority of Americans actually agreed as well. So we know that American Jews and actually the majority of American society regard anti-Zionism as a form of anti-Semitism, and we need to say so. It's one thing to criticize Israel. Israel is certainly not above reproach, nor is any other country. But once that criticism delves into denying its very right to exist or denying that the Jews have a right to self-determination, that crosses a line that we have to view as completely unacceptable. So that's anti-Semitism as it manifests itself largely on the left. On the right, it manifests itself in white supremacy, the sort of traditional anti-Semitism we've come to see from neo-Nazi groups and the KKK. When you had neo-Nazis marching in Virginia, when you've seen them marching in various other places in America, that is a very real form of anti-Semitism. And we've seen that many of the attacks, the physical attacks that have taken place have been perpetrated by far-right extremists, and that certainly remains a concern. We have seen increased instances of anti-Semitism within the Black community. Many of the attacks that are being perpetrated in Brooklyn are being carried out by young Black men. They are, of course, not at all representative of the broader Black community, but it is certainly a problem that needs to be addressed. We, of course, have seen some extremist elements arise from within the Muslim community in America. That, of course, is something that often dovetails with the other forms of anti-Semitism that we've discussed. But the fact that, again, that it comes from so many different areas and so many different parts of society makes it a challenge that's often difficult for people to grasp. And yet it is incumbent upon all of us to point out that this is a problem that needs to be addressed in its variety of forms, and that we can't lift up our hands and say, no, the problem is too much to handle, or that somehow one form of anti-Semitism is worse. It's all bad, and it all needs to be combated if we're ever to rout out this problem.
Indeed. So let's turn the page from that form of anti-Semitism to the pressing issues of Gaza, which face Israel. A ceasefire between Israel and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad took hold after 5 days of intense rocket fire from Gaza into Israel. The Egyptian brokered ceasefire came into force just after Shabbat, 10 p.m. Saturday night. It was followed by a barrage of rockets from Gaza, retaliatory Israeli strikes on terror positions in the coastal enclave. Now, you describe the cycles of intense warfare in one of your latest articles, followed by a sort of tense calm, which I guess you're experiencing even tonight, between Israel and the Palestinian terror groups. But you do hold out hope. You say that there is another way. Avi, they've got enough rockets to start this again. They can throw rockets over without it making headlines. They can do 2 or 3. They can set fire to a field near Sderot. They can do that kind of thing and get away with it. But it's the amount of rockets that come over that start a cycle of violence over days again. How do we stop that? How do we stop the cycle of violence? And what is this other way you're talking about?
Look, it's become almost formulaic, meaning we've had so many of these rounds of violence, we almost know what to expect, right? There will be a wave of rocket attacks. Israel will respond by targeting terror infrastructure and terrorist leaders. That will yield perhaps even more rockets. This whole back and forth will happen. There'll be rumors of a ceasefire. The ceasefire will actually come into effect. And then sometime later, we will find ourselves in the same exact position, going through the same exact process. This is something that not only wreaks havoc on Israeli lives, as it certainly does, but on Gaza lives as well. And we have to acknowledge that. It is often the Palestinians in Gaza who bear the brunt of these rounds of violence, who are not in the least bit protected by their authorities, quite to the contrary, are used as human shields by Hamas, which controls the Gaza Strip. And so the question, of course, is how do we break these cycles? The suggestion that I raised in that column is that there have been models proposed by Israel, including the most immediate government, immediate path government, and others beforehand, that basically suggest that if Hamas were to commit to a long-term ceasefire and lay down its weapons, Israel would not only facilitate, but would encourage massive international investment in the Gaza Strip to increase and improve civilian infrastructure, to raise the quality of life in Gaza, to connect Gaza to the West Bank and to the rest of the world, to ensure that trade was possible. Really, the sky is the limit. And so if that is the case, that Israeli governments, successive Israeli governments on the right and on the left have supported this, one has to wonder, what is the obstacle? And the obstacle, I think, is quite obvious. It is Hamas, which up until now has not had an incentive to cooperate with such a thing, because it runs counter to its interest, which is to destroy Israel and wreak havoc on the region. And so if that is the case, then it appears as though Hamas needs to be pressured. It's not going to do this out of its goodwill. It does not view the good, the high quality of living for the people of Gaza as being a tremendously high priority for it. And so my contention, and I believe this is shared by others, is that a combination of international pressure by those actors who do exert influence on Hamas, and there are several of them that may have an interest in doing this, including Qatar, Turkey, Egypt, and others, combined with internal dissatisfaction on the part of the Palestinian residents of Gaza, who are not the least bit happy about having to go through this time and time again, that those two sources of pressure may indeed force Hamas to actually contemplate a resolution of, or at least a suspension of the conflict for the foreseeable future that would enable not only Gazans, but also Israelis to enjoy a period of peace, calm, and prosperity.
Avi, you describe the idea that Hamas is at odds with its people. The people would rather live in a more prosperous society. But is that true? Is there enough good faith among the people of Gaza to Israel, to peace, to changing their lot, to changing Hamas? I do worry sometimes that one of the reasons why we don't have a reliable peace partner on the Palestinian side is actually because the Palestinian people largely don't support it.
Well, look, the polls indicate different things, and it's not always clear which ones are more reliable, but they seem to suggest that the majority of Palestinians do still, or at least a plurality of Palestinians, do still support a two-state solution. Now, there are obviously all sorts of provisos to that. Many of them support a two-state solution, and also a supposed right of return for the descendants of Palestinian refugees to Israel, which of course means that Israel would no longer exist. And so, you know, we should take everything with a grain of salt, but at least that indicates to us that there is some glimmer of hope or some desire for a better future. Ultimately, though, I don't feel that I need to rely on the goodwill of this people or that towards others or towards me, my society. I think that it's much more important to them that they live good lives and that their children are raised in safety and in prosperity. I think that's what any parent wants. You know, certainly there are those who are brainwashed themselves and who brainwash their children to engage in violence. I would like to believe, and I do believe, that they are a minority. And that ultimately, if a Palestinian family is given the choice to prosper, to put food on the table, to ensure that their children are being educated and raised in an environment that is secure and calm and peaceful, that is an option the majority of Palestinians, including in Gaza, will choose. And so I believe that there is hope that that can happen. I think it will, again, require significant pressure on Hamas to loosen its grip. It won't do it willingly, it won't do it out of goodwill. But if it is forced to do so, then I think that there is indeed a chance that we could see a more prosperous and brighter future for both peoples.
And we pray for peace. And indeed, the Abraham Accords has shown that it is possible to build a diplomatic bridge to the Arab world, particularly in the Gulf and other places. Talking of tense standoffs, Avi, we are in a moment of tense national calm over the proposed judicial reform proposals. Where are we at the moment? Will Netanyahu continue to push the envelope as he has, push the envelope over the edge as far as we could see in the diaspora? Or will cool heads prevail? I mean, I saw an interview that he did with Piers Morgan on Talk TV, my channel. He actually addressed Piers Morgan's Talk TV audience before he addressed the Israeli people hours before it. And he said basically that the 61-seat majority in the Knesset for superiority over judges, no, it's going to be watered down. You just wonder whether actually he got through some of the things that he wanted to prevail for him personally, and now he's going to push through 50 or 60% of them rather than the whole thing. Avi, where are we with this crisis?
Look, in the month and a half that I've been on this job, I have spoken to, I would say, almost all of the senior leaders of political parties in Israel, certainly a majority of them. And what I have heard almost uniformly is that no one believes that we're going to go back to the initial proposal that had been presented for what this judicial reform could look like, and that ultimately there will have to be some form of a compromise. Now, what that compromise looks like, we don't know. There are several different parts to this judicial reform. It's unclear how much willingness there will be to compromise on each individual part. But there are negotiations underway under the auspices of Israel's president, Isaac Herzog, at the presidential residence here in Jerusalem, in an effort to reach some sort of a compromise that will enable the country to just cool down a little bit. The period before Passover, before Pesach, was extremely tense. There were reports in various newspapers around the world that Israel was on the brink of collapse, that the Zionist experiment was coming to an end. Those were quite overblown, but it was a very unpleasant environment, and one that did generate a great deal of tension at the time. No one wants to go back to that. No one wants to go back to a situation where the country's economy is being held hostage by this process and by those who oppose it. And I think that ultimately that is going to be what will drive the sides to some sort of a compromise. What that looks like when we see it happen, I don't know. But I think that is the direction that we're headed.
I did an extensive podcast on this, wearing a crash helmet, because it was such a divisive discussion, even here in the diaspora. And that's my question for you, Avi, as someone who started life as a diaspora Jew, who has worked in the diaspora. What should we do in the diaspora about judicial reform? The talk has always been that we really, as diaspora Jews, we're here to support Israel. We're not really here to indulge ourselves with domestic Israeli politics. However, if the outcome of the nature of Israel's democracy is changed by judicial reforms, should we not speak out as Western citizens or subjects from modern democratic countries? In other words, if Israel doesn't resemble a liberal democracy like the one that we live in, Britain, or France, Germany, other places, does this make it more difficult for diaspora Jews to support Israel against the forces of anti-Zionism or anti-Semitism? I'm not saying for one moment that I'm a bit of an unconditional supporter of Israel, but you are hamstrung, aren't you, in the diaspora if suddenly the Israel that you support has illiberal tendencies that your country doesn't. It's very difficult to debate that with a fellow citizen of the country that you live in.
Look, I think, first of all, I don't want to minimize the challenge posed by the judicial reform, about which we have been quite critical at the newspaper and will continue to be. But I also don't want to overinflate it. At the end of the day, even if these reforms pass, Israel will remain a democracy, perhaps a more challenged one, perhaps one that will constantly be on edge, but Israel will continue to be a democracy, and there should be no suggestion that Israel will at any point cease to be one. That said, you raise an interesting question, which has to do with the extent to which diaspora Jews ought to have a role or a voice in domestic Israeli politics. And I would agree with you that for the most part, diaspora Jews probably should not have a voice in domestic Israeli politics. They don't live here. This is not a place in which they pay taxes or in which they send their children to war. And so when it comes to purely domestic Israeli concerns, it's probably best for American Jews, British Jews, Australian Jews, Jews around the world to take a bit of a backseat. But I do think that there is perhaps a qualitative difference or a difference in character when it comes to those issues that do affect Israel's national identity or its character, or particularly those things that do have real ramifications for diaspora Jews. This could include questions of religion and state, the recognition of non-Orthodox Jews in Israel, questions of what the character of the country is, and the balance between Israel's Jewish identity and its democratic character. And there are those who would say that this fits into that category because it does have the potential of shifting Israel's national character or shaping it in a certain way. And so I think that it is reasonable for diaspora Jewish leaders to express concerns constructively. I don't think that calls for boycotts or suggestions that Israeli leaders shouldn't be welcome in Jewish forums are helpful. But I do think that respectfully and civilly expressing concerns or opposition to this or that aspect of reform is something that is appropriate in this situation. And I would hope that again, will be done in a way that does not do any harm, that is done in a manner that is promoting constructive debate and constructive solutions. And I think ultimately, for the most part, American Jewish and British Jewish and Australian Jewish and other Jewish leaders around the world have been doing exactly that.
We're going to have a bit of Eurovision fun in just a moment because Israel got points on the board, as Governor DeSantis keeps on saying in Florida. We came third. Very well done, Israel, with Noah Kirel. Have a bit of fun with that in a moment. But another question from the floor. This comes from Elaine Gray. Let's just spool back a little bit with how you talked about the stakeholders in Hamas, for want of a better word, Egypt, Qatar, Turkey. Hamas is so extreme, writes Elaine Gray, that they will never be a reliable peace partner. What, Avi, are your views on who in Gaza and Judea and Samaria, the Arab community around the world, would be a viable alternative? I snicker slightly at the idea that Egypt negotiates ceasefires. I mean, why can't we get the UAE in on this? You know, that would be a very good broker. I'd prefer them at the table. Bahrain, that would be nice. Even Saudi, that would be helpful. That would be interesting. Who is a viable peace partner, Avi? Is there one, or do we have to use our imagination here?
I should note that I'm going to have to jump off momentarily. I do have another commitment, but look, I don't know that we have a partner for peace at the moment in Gaza. And that's not what we're talking about. I'm not suggesting that we will end up having a peace agreement signed on the White House lawn between Israel and Hamas. That is not in the offing. What I am suggesting, what others have suggested, is that Hamas can perhaps be forced to contemplate a long-term ceasefire that would be monitored and upheld by the international community, which would ensure that arms aren't making its way to Hamas, that it's not arming itself or preparing for the next round of violence with Israel. And that is something that could indeed be encouraged by a variety of actors. Unfortunately, the actors that you mentioned are not ones that exert the same level of influence on Hamas as Egypt, Turkey, Qatar, and others. But I will say that Egypt in particular has played a largely constructive role, including in the last round of violence, in bringing about a momentary ceasefire, or at least a ceasefire that's held up until this point. And one could hope that perhaps it could play a constructive role in a longer-term ceasefire as well.
Avi, before you go, tell us about Israel's consistent success at Eurovision. And isn't it heartening that when the popular vote comes in from European people, it appears that Europeans aren't averse to voting for Israel, even if they're European Union meisters, which I think is precisely the word, are anti-Israel. It's good to see that Israel does really well in Eurovision rather consistently.
Yeah, I agree entirely. As you said, Noah Kirel got third place in the Eurovision Song Contest this year. That's a remarkable achievement, and of course, we congratulate her. And I think you're right. It does tell an interesting story that runs counter to perhaps conventional wisdom about Israel's popularity in Europe and in other places in the world. I think for the first time, countries that are not part of the Eurovision Song Contest were able to vote this year. And Israel got many votes from those countries around the world. And so maybe we have more friends than we thought we did. And I think that there's something hopeful to that. And maybe that's a sign that we can look forward to next year in Stockholm, taking it back to Jerusalem.
Next year in Stockholm is the new way of producing our hope on this. Avi Mayer, editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post, 12 points for an excellent interview. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Have you just got 1 or 2 minutes to enable Steve Winston, our chief executive, to propose a vote of thanks to you? Steve.
Sure.
Steve, you're on mute.
Hi, Avi. We won't keep you much longer, but just to say on behalf of us all here, the National Jewish Assembly, Jonny Gould, and our guests tonight, thank you very much for joining us. We know your time is very pulled in every direction. It's been great listening to your insight, and actually I've really enjoyed your glass half full outlook. It's very much appreciated. It certainly gives an alternative perspective on the many things and the many challenges that Israel is facing. So on behalf of us all, thank you. I'm sure there's plenty of people here in the audience tonight who are long-standing readers of the J Post, and I certainly am, and I certainly look forward to reading more of it under your directorship. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ali.
Take care.
So the next sort of 5 to 10 minutes, I'm just going to ask Jonny Gould to say a few words about his podcast, and then I'm going to say a few more words about future meetings, and that'll be it. So probably 10 more minutes. So Jonny, want to talk?
Gary, thank you very much for this opportunity, and hello to everyone. I hope you enjoyed the interview with Avi there. I think he spoke with, as Steve said, optimism, which I think is the grist of Israeli and Jewish society and us all. Jonny Gould's Jewish State is a response by myself, a very personal one, to aid the story of Israel and the Jewish diaspora around the world. And if you're not a regular listener, then I invite you to subscribe. You can find Jonny Gould's Jewish State in Apple Podcasts, in Spotify, and Google, and wherever you get your podcasts. It's also a 24-hour radio station. I'm really pushing this out as a new and dynamic media. You can find that at jewishstate.radio. It really is 24 hours a day, and we have programs, the idea being that there's always something interesting for you to engage with on the radio, jewishstate.radio, and the podcast, which is the driver of the content, at Jonny Gould's Jewish State. I always try to get the best interviewees that I can. It's not parish pump. It's about major guests with major things to say. So my most recent episode was with Ronen Bergman, the author of the estimable New York Times bestseller Rise and Kill First. It's a book that he thought would take him a year to write and publish. In the end, it took him 6 years and a further 2 years to verify, to edit, and to ultimately publish. The previous episode was with the remarkable Trevor Horn, the million-selling record producer, who happens to go to my synagogue. Perhaps more remarkably, he's not Jewish, but he told me in the interview that he believed in Judaism more than he believed in anything else. So it is a stem-by-stem analysis of some of his greatest records: Owner of a Lonely Heart, Relaxed, Two Tribes, ABC's records, but it's also about his appreciation of Shabbat and keeping kosher, it's a remarkable interview. I've had a couple of exclusives over the years. The Red Sea spy story, I managed to get the first ever interview in English with, his name was Agent Danny at the time. He's been revealed as Danny Limor. He led the amazing partnership between Ethiopia's Jews and Mossad, which engaged in getting Ethiopian Jews out of Sudanese horror camps to a new life in Israel between 1978 and 1983. That was an exclusive. That's a wonderful episode, The Red Sea Spies. I think it's such a remarkable story of Israeli triumph that it should be part of the national curriculum in Israel. I think more people should know about that remarkable story. I also cover Jewish stories here domestically. I've done the Bristol Jewish community, Bristol Jewish University problem with David Miller, the anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic professor. Covered that in detail with Sabrina Miller. That goes back a few episodes. Judicial reform, the story of Gary Lineker and his troublesome tweets as well. I've covered that recently. And I just invite you to communicate with me, to write on Twitter, to write on Facebook. I appear on there regularly at Jonny Gould Show, and to subscribe to my podcast at Jonny Gould's Jewish State. Gary, Dahlia, Steve, thank you very much for this wonderful opportunity tonight.
So can I thank you, Jonny, so much for giving up your time this evening to interview Avi and telling us about your podcast as well. So in the remaining couple of minutes, I just want to remind everybody, we have about 350 members at the moment. We're aiming to get up to 1,000 plus in the not too distant future. It's only £10 a year to join, and you'll get regular communication from us, from our office, telling you about all future events. You won't just have to hear it via an advertisement. So please do join if you haven't done so already. www.nja.org.uk, and I repeat, it's only £10 a year. I just want to finish off by telling you about our next two events. The first one is on the 1st of June, where we have Tomer Adubi, and it's to do with media anti-Semitism and focusing thereon. And that's actually a hybrid event. You can go in person if you want to somewhere in Earl's Court where it will be held, but you can also join online, and quite a lot of people have already registered for that. That's Tomer Adubi. The second speaker in June will be on the 28th of June, and that will be face-to-face with a rather controversial, he's a bit more establishment now, Lee Anderson, who is the Deputy Chairman of the Conservative Party. That will be face-to-face at a major central London synagogue. And there'll be a small charge to cover food and drink, etc. And that will be, as I said, on the 28th of June, which I believe is a Wednesday evening. And we will have another.
Gary, you forgot the 22nd of June with Gil Hoffman.
I've got 3 meetings in June. We have Gil Hoffman, a former executive from the Jerusalem Post, who now runs Honest Reporting. And that is also face-to-face, and that is also going to be at a major central London synagogue. So we have 3 meetings in June. So we've got plenty of choice. And we will also, before the summer break, I'm hoping there'll be one final meeting in early July where we might have a collection of speakers from the Jewish community. Can I just say thank you all very much for attending tonight. It's wonderful to see so many of you, and I wish you an enjoyable rest of the evening. Thank you.